This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get free access to Nebula, the streaming platform built by all your favorite YouTubers, when you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below. About 600,000 people experience homelessness in the US. Think about your own life. You might not be homeless, or necessarily even know someone who is or has been. But you certainly know someone paying too much for rent, someone having trouble finding a place to live, someone facing eviction. In other words, someone who could become homeless without much needing to go wrong. More and more Americans are joining this category every day. The truth is that in 95% of US counties, those who work a full-time minimum wage job cannot afford even a one-bedroom apartment. Change that to a two-bedroom and the entire country becomes unaffordable. This situation is only getting worse. As a result of the pandemic, rising housing costs, wage stagnation, and the inadequate policies of our local and federal governments, the number of people experiencing homelessness and of people on the brink has been steadily growing for the past decade. That is, if you only look at the US. In this episode, we're looking at Finland's approach to homelessness, what Housing First is, and what it could mean for the American economy. In Finland, only about 5,000 people, 0.1% of the population, are homeless. And that's even with the broadest definition of what constitutes homelessness, which includes more than who you typically think of when you hear the term. The Finnish definition of homelessness goes beyond just those who are living on the street or in emergency accommodations like shelters. In some cities, like the country's capital Helsinki, no one sleeps on the street. That type of homelessness has been completely eliminated. Compare that to the US's nearly 600,000 homeless people, which is almost exclusively so-called rough sleepers, those who live on the street, and the problem starts to become apparent. What's more important, though, is that homelessness isn't just low in Finland, it's actively going down. Between 2010 and 2018, Finland enjoyed a massive 40% decline in the homelessness rate. If it sounds like we're cherry-picking data, even during the pandemic, which, let me remind you, has caused a massive surge of homelessness in the US, homelessness in Finland did not increase. So what happened? How is Finland so effectively reducing homelessness? In 2007, the Finnish government started a national Housing First program. Housing First is a philosophy that argues that to make progress on homelessness, particularly chronic homelessness, you need more than temporary emergency solutions. You need permanent housing right out the gate. In other words, housing is the starting point, not the end point. The way Housing First programs work is pretty simple. People experiencing homelessness receive independent housing immediately, without having to first fulfill mental health, sobriety, income, employment, or other requirements. Once they're housed, support services are offered, not imposed, and over time, the newly housed begin to finance part of the cost of their housing to the degree that they can afford it. It sounds pretty intuitive, but this is very different from the more common continuum of care or staircase approach we're mostly using. In continuum of care programs, homeless people are expected to make progress on any mental health or addiction issues they may have, and to pass a certain standard before being housed. In this system, housing is at the top of the staircase. These individual changes that these programs require are the sorts of things that are incredibly difficult to address when you are still contending with the anxiety of not having a home, possibly still sleeping on the street. In these continuum of care programs, only once you have demonstrated some change, which we should keep in mind is incredibly difficult to achieve without housing stability, do these programs graduate you into housing arrangements, first shared housing, and slowly over time independent housing. To some, continuum of care approaches sound great. That is, in theory. They map onto our society's values of meritocracy, of security. Only those who are deserving get access to the prize of having a home. Under this mentality, if you don't have a home, it must be because you're just not good enough yet. Come back later. It should be obvious that these programs just don't work. Not only do they strip people of their agency and come with an enormous moral burden, but recidivism is high and a huge number of people don't make it into the program in the first place because of the high barrier to entry. Compare that to Housing First. In the initial study on Housing First, back in 2003, a randomized trial of the two approaches decidedly shows the strength of the new program. Around half of the initially homeless group were accepted into permanent housing, regardless of their eligibility according to other programs, and they were then offered tailored and optional care for their individual circumstances. The other half went through conventional channels, and at the end of the trial, the results were clear. The Housing First group spent more time in stable housing, less time hospitalized, and results carried over for longer than when homeless people went through the continuum of care path. Within just 6 months, Housing First had virtually eliminated homelessness in the experimental group. It was a massive success. That first study was in New York, and inspired by its promising results, the EU ran its own pilot programs in 5 European countries with the same outcome: secure, long-term housing stability. And now that it's become the official national policy of the Finnish government, we've seen just how much good this can achieve. It is abundantly clear that this approach works. Despite all of this, some of you might still be skeptical. Forget for a second that housing is a universal right we are all entitled to, that it is baked into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the US has signed onto and agreed to provide in front of the entire international community. Forget that this right doesn't include temporary shelters, but only real, stable housing, and that there are metrics around accessibility, affordability, discrimination, and protection from eviction which good Housing First programs conform to perfectly, in addition to affirming the basic idea of being decent to real human people. You might still wonder about costs in the wealthiest country in the world that regularly provides housing subsidies mostly to the wealthiest people in the country through mortgage interest tax deductions costing the American people, $70 billion a year, or close to 25 times what is set aside for homelessness programs at the federal level. Imagine all that incredibly important stuff doesn't matter. It's gone, forget about it. Housing First is still cheaper than not housing people or walking them through an ineffective continuum of care program. Not only are people housed through Housing First covering part of the cost and are more easily employed, but housing people saves money in the long term on comparatively costly emergency hospitalization bills and absurdly expensive policing, which both go down when 1. People's needs are taken care of preventatively, and 2. They aren't exposed to an expensive state apparatus that has criminalized existing without a house. Given all this evidence, you're probably wondering, why aren't we doing this? To be fair, there are some small-scale examples of this in the US. The US Department of Housing and Urban Development does fund certain homelessness programs, some of them with the Housing First methods. However, these programs are only robust in a few cities and states. But no matter the nature of the program, whether it's Housing First, continuum of care, or something else, funding is far too low. The HUD's budget and municipal aid funds have steadily declined over time, and as a result, programs scrape together a budget from the general public and several different local and federal funds, rarely ever amounting to what they actually need to provide effective services. But the main problem behind all of this isn't that homelessness programs aren't getting enough funding. That is an issue just a little further down the line. The underlying problem is affordable housing. And at the core of that problem is our capitalist organization of the economy. Under a capitalist economy, housing isn't treated like the right it's considered to be by most nations, including, on paper, the United States. Instead, it's a commodity, something to be traded, speculated on, turned for a profit. That is the main goal of housing in a commodity market. Not putting people in homes, making money. As a result, developers, investors, and the like don't focus their energy on housing the poor, from whom they can only extract so much, but rather on building luxury accommodations for the wealthy, leaving largely empty units across the country only rarely occupied, if at all, while people in desperate need of housing are refused access and subjected to a manufactured housing scarcity. On top of that, there is a very real incentive for capitalists to only partially resolve homelessness. The threat of losing the roof over your head keeps even the most exploited worker in a job they hate. Increasingly, that threat forces people into even more dire conditions as wages become less and less sufficient to cover housing costs, forcing people to take on several jobs and work untenable hours to avoid the possibility of eviction. It is not in the capitalist interest to remove that powerful, terrifying incentive. And here is where the Finnish success story may go beyond Housing First alone. Not only is Housing First doing a good job of taking people out of homelessness in a reliable way, but a social democratic organizing of the economy is limiting the extent to which people are likely to fall into it in the first place. It's still capitalism, so it still relies on somebody being exploited, in this case people in the global south, but at the very least, social democracy goes part of the way on neutering perverse capitalist incentives on continuing homelessness domestically. One key element of this is unionization. High unionization at 75% of the Finnish workforce, and therefore higher wages and higher job security than in freer markets, mean that as people exit homelessness, they are unlikely to be replaced or fall back into it themselves. American conservatives love to rail against Housing First, touting its failures to make significant changes in cities like Los Angeles, where homelessness has continued to rise despite Housing First programs taking root. What they conveniently forget to mention is that the continuum of care programs they prefer still deliver worse results. And the core issue of the skyrocketing housing prices in the free market is why people are even pushed out into homelessness in the first place. The thing is, it doesn't have to be this way. There are solutions to reduce the scale of this issue. Earlier this year, the Gravel Institute released a great video on one of these solutions, the decommodification of housing. I'll put a link to that video and all of the sources for this one in the description. At the end of the day, the conclusion that you should take away from the Finnish case isn't just that this one type of program works really well at taking people out of an incredibly difficult situation for the benefit of everyone. It does do that, but that's not the point. The Finnish example gives us a glimpse of how we can treat housing differently. Instead of being a game for the wealthy to gamble their own fortunes and the livelihoods of millions of Americans, Housing First shows us what housing really is: a necessity, a right. It's something that must come before almost everything else, something which we must guarantee, or fail to recognize the humanity of millions of people. If you're interested in what the future of housing might look like, I highly recommend you check out Home of the Future on CuriosityStream. It's a fascinating look at cutting-edge production methods and radically different approaches to housing than those we see today. CuriosityStream is an established streaming platform with a solid track record of caring about great educational content and the financial security of those who produce it. They've got thousands of nonfiction titles from some of the best filmmakers in the game. As you probably know, YouTube doesn't treat its creators very well. That's why some of my YouTuber friends and I teamed up to build Nebula, so we don't have to worry about demonetization. As educational creators ourselves, we love CuriosityStream, so we've worked out a deal, where if you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below, you'll also get access to Nebula, 100% free. That's less than $15 a year for both CuriosityStream and Nebula, which, in my humble opinion, is a pretty great deal. Since you're already on the internet watching my video, why not spend some time learning about fascinating topics on CuriosityStream? Or check out Nebula's original content, including my upcoming series on the resurgence of fascism. You can also watch all my videos as they were intended, ad-free. There really is something for everyone, and by signing up at the link below, you're helping us produce more content without the fear of demonetization. Give CuriosityStream a shot, and get free access to Nebula when you sign up using the link below. It really does help support my channel and educational creators all across YouTube. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more like it, consider subscribing to stay up to date with my latest episodes. If you hated it, go ahead and drop a thumbs down. You can check out my previous episodes by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.